When AI relieves the burden of thought, what ancient wisdom knew about the mind's trap. A 2025 study from Harvard Neuroscience Labs confirmed something that would have shocked nobody 1,000 years ago. What we call reality is more of a construction than a discovery. Your brain doesn't passively receive the world, it predicts it, then checks those predictions against incoming data. When researchers triggered specific neural patterns in mice, they created visual illusions on demand. The animals saw what wasn't there, convinced by their own predictive machinery that the hallucination was real. The scientists called this breakthrough. Mystics called it Tuesday. I'm Mark Roach. This is Transcendent. For 15 years, I've studied the gap between what consciousness can do and what our thinking convinces us is possible. Probably more than 15 years, but just had to pull a number out of the air there. What I want to show you today cuts deeper than neuroscience or philosophy. It reaches into the very pattern that we've been repeating since the first civilizations rose and fell. We're going to explore why the mind might be both humanity's greatest gift and most dangerous trap, and why every master tradition warns against the tyranny of thought, and why artificial intelligence might force us to the very awakening our stories have always promised, but our mental constructs consistently prevent. You'll walk away understanding three things. First, how modern neuroscience accidentally validated what Jesus, Buddha, and indigenous wisdom keepers have said for millennia about the mind's relationship to reality. Second, why every great civilization, from Rome to the Maya, has collapsed under the weight of its own mental constructions and technological excess. And third, why AI's potential to relieve us from compulsive thinking might create the conditions for a new kind of mental workout, one that develops capacities we've neglected for 10,000 years. But here's the part that will stay with you long after this video ends. What if the burden that we've carried since the agricultural revolution isn't meant to be solved, but surrendered? Consider the mind as reality constructor. When Anil Seth stood on the TED stage in 2017, he said something that sent ripples through both neuroscience and contemplative communities. We're all hallucinating all the time. What we call reality is a controlled hallucination, your brain's best guess at what's causing the sensory signals arriving from the outside world. The data backs this up in ways that are genuinely unsettling. In Cardiff, researchers studied patients prone to hallucinations and found they were simply people whose top-down predictions overwhelmed their bottom-up sensory input. Their brains were so convinced that what should be there, that actually reality couldn't break through. The kicker? We're all doing this, just with better calibration. This isn't some fringe theory. In 2014, comprehensive reviews published in the National Institutes of Health confirmed that human perception operates through what they called active construction. Your brain fills gaps using past experience. It bends reality to meet expectations. Every optical illusion you've ever seen exploits this. Your visual system sees it correctly, but another part of your brain overrides the data, creating a new reality that feels absolutely certain. Think about that. Think about that. I mean, the thing that you're most sure of, direct sensory experience, is actually an interpreted simulation. Now, here's where it gets interesting for those of us tracking consciousness evolution. This isn't new information. A 2019 study in Scientific American traced how our perceptions are predictions wrapped in Bayesian inference, constantly generating forecasts about incoming data, then using prediction errors to update the model. The brain isn't a camera. It's a prediction engine that occasionally checks its work. Jesus talked about this 2,000 years ago, though he used different language. The kingdom of God is within you, he said, not coming with observable signs, not out there in the world of forms and institutions, within. The divine field already present in each being, accessible only when you stop trying to think your way to it. Luke 17:21 gets mistranslated constantly, turned into something about a future heaven, but the actual teaching was about inner sovereignty, the realization that what you're seeking through mental construction and external validation is already present, already accessible, already whole. You can't think your way there because thinking is the mechanism that obscures it. The Bhagavad Gita says the same thing through Krishna's mouth. When meditation is mastered, the mind becomes unwavering like a flame in a windless place. Not thinking harder, not achieving some mental state, but settling into what's beneath the constant churning of thought. Buddhist psychology has an entire framework for this, the ghost stories our minds create. There's a Zen koan, K-O-A-N, about a man who's haunted by a ghost who knows everything he's thinking. Terrified, he visits a master who smiles and says, "Ask the ghost to tell you something you don't know yet." The man does. The ghost vanishes. It was never external. It was a pattern of his own guilt and unresolved emotion given form by the mind's compulsive meaning-making. Here's the pattern. The mind creates reality through story, gets trapped in that story, then defends the story as if questioning it means death. So consider the violence of mental construction. Every wisdom tradition I've studied, and I mean every single one, warns about a specific danger, mistaking your mental gap for the territory itself. The Tao Te Ching opens with this: the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. The other words, the moment you crystallize reality into concept, you've already lost what's real. Now you're operating in symbol, not presence. Tibetan Buddhism calls this trap of conceptual elaboration. Aboriginal Dreamtime law teaches that that country itself holds knowledge, accessible only when you stop imposing your stories on the land. The Lakota phrase, Michikulai Oisin, all my relations, points to a web of connection that thinking fragments into separate things. Here's what makes this urgent rather than philosophical. The mind just doesn't create benign stories. It creates violent ones, survival-based ones. These survival-based ones, stories that divide the world into us and them, safe and threatening, worthy and disposable. Now, when Jesus talked about the power within, accessible through inner connection, not through institutions, not through external authority, not through the priesthood, he was pointing to something that threatened every power structure of his time, and it still does. Because if the divine is accessed internally, you don't need the mediators, you don't need the gatekeepers, you don't need the entire apparatus of control that runs on convincing you that truth is external, authority is outside, salvation comes through their particular door. Peter demonstrated the impossibility of holding the holy state while clinging to the old mental constructs. Well, the moment in Acts where he's given the vision of unclean animals and hears the voice saying, "Do not call unclean what God has made clean," that's the mind's categorical system being shattered. all his Hebrew purity laws, all his mental frameworks about who deserves grace and who doesn't, revealed as human construction rather than divine mandate. The text says he was greatly perplexed. Of course he was. His entire reality was built on those distinctions. When the foundation cracks, everything built on it becomes unstable. We see this in civilization after civilization. The mental constructs grow more elaborate. The stories become more complex. The technologies that empower human will over the physical world advance and then collapse. So let's look at the pattern of civilizational excess. Joseph Tainter spent his career studying why complex societies collapse. His conclusion, published across decades of archaeological research, civilizations fail when the cost of maintaining complexity outweighs the benefits, diminishing marginal returns on investment in infrastructure, governance, and problem solving. Eventually, the whole system becomes too expensive to sustain. But look at what drives that complexity: mental construction. The stories a civilization tells about who they are, what they deserve, how the world should work. Rome had the story of eternal empire, manifest destiny written in divine favor. They built infrastructure to match, roads spanning continents, aqueducts feeding cities of 1 million people, military apparatus controlling from Britain to Persia. The cost grew, productivity stagnated, heavy taxation to fund the machine created resentment. The military couldn't defend borders stretched too thin. In the story, we are Rome. We are eternal. Prevented the adaptation that might have saved them. The Maya built their entire civilization on the story of divine kings who controlled the cosmos through ritual. The drought came and paleoclimate data confirms severe water stress in the 8th and 9th centuries. Well, the story couldn't hold. Food shortages, social unrest, population collapse, not because they lacked intelligence or capability, but because their mental framework about how reality worked prevented them from seeing what was actually happening until it was too late. The Akkadian Empire, the Indus Valley civilization, the Bronze Age collapse that took down interconnected societies across the Mediterranean. Same pattern. Mental constructs about control, about human dominance over nature, about technological solutions to systemic problems, and then environmental stress that revealed those constructs as inadequate. A 2024 study analyzing multiple civilizational collapses found something fascinating. Societies became more fragile over time, not more resilient. Why? Because they optimized for their current model rather than maintaining adaptability. They got better and better at being what they were and lost the capacity to become something else. So here's what the data looks like in practice. Before the Industrial Revolution, physical labor was necessary survival work. You farmed to eat. You built to shelter. You hunted to live. And then we created machines that did the labor. And what happened? We invented gyms. We created artificial circumstances to stress our bodies because physical challenge turned out to be necessary for health, not just production. We took the burden of physical work, relieved it through technology, and then had to recreate it through pretend circumstances because our bodies needed the stress to function optimally. Now apply that pattern to thinking. Consider the burden of thought. For 10,000 years, the agricultural revolution created the conditions for civilization. Human survival is required thinking, planting crops, managing resources, coordinating labor, building institutions, creating stories that bind strangers into functional groups. The mind became humanity's primary survival tool. And like any tool used constantly, it developed tremendous power. Mathematics, engineering, science, philosophy, art, marketing. The entire edifice of human culture built on the mind's capacity to abstract, symbolize, and systematize. Here's what we're only now beginning to recognize. Constant thinking might be as unnatural and damaging as constant physical labor. Medieval workers, farmers, carpenters, merchants worked hard, brutally hard by our standards. But a 1308 text makes a distinction that modern people miss entirely. Their work was not physical exercise. It was forced movement, not voluntary movement chosen for the body's development. Real exercise required walking at your own initiative without doing anything else at a fast pace until you felt tired and your breathing altered. In other words, even in 1308, people understood that survival labor and developmental practices were different categories. Now we're facing the mental equivalent. Compulsive thinking and the constant stream of planning, analyzing, judging, and narrating isn't meditation. It's not consciousness development. It's survival mode extended past necessity into pathology. A 2026 study in AI brain fry found something telling. Workers using AI extensively reported significant mental fatigue, not relief. Why? Because they weren't freed from thinking. They were burdened with a new kind of thinking, metacognitive effort, thinking about thinking, evaluating the evaluator, spending 8 hours mentally babysitting digital interns instead of doing the actual work. The researchers described it as forcing our brains to operate in ways they weren't evolutionarily designed to function for 8 straight hours a day. Information saturation, relentless task switching, cognitive overload. But what if that's not a bug in AI implementation? What if it's showing us that thinking itself, the way we've been doing it, was always the burden? So consider what AI might reveal. My novel, The Awakening Chronicles, or that series, explores a moment when human civilization realizes the stories we tell, the mental constructs we build, the technologies we create to empower our will over physical. These follow a pattern that has always led to collapse. The characters discover what indigenous wisdom keepers have maintained for millennia. Consciousness itself is trying to evolve. And human thinking is both the vehicle and the obstacle. In The Gap, I wrote about the space between what we are and what we're becoming. That gap isn't geographical or temporal. It's the distance between mind and awareness, between thinking and presence, between constructed story and what's actually here. Both novels point to the same recognition. Every civilization that tried to control its way to stability failed. Every attempt to think our way to salvation created a new problem that required new thinking, that created new problems. These books take us through this pattern to its logical conclusion. What if Earth's role in cosmic evolution isn't to achieve technological sophistication that matches advanced civilizations, but to preserve something those civilizations lost when they optimized thinking and control? The capacity for direct perception, consciousness connection with living systems, the willingness to not know in service of the genuine relationship with what is. A key passage from Solar System Consciousness, one of my books, describes technologically advanced civilizations requesting Earth's wisdom, not our methods, not our preserved relationships with ecological intelligence, healing presence, cultural authenticity. They'd solve problems mechanically while damaging capacities that mechanical solutions can never restore once lost. This is the pattern that we're entering with AI. If artificial intelligence can handle the burden of thinking, the planning, the analysis, the information processing, the optimization, what becomes of human consciousness? One possibility, we atrophy further, becoming dependent on the AI the way we became dependent on cars for movement and screens for attention. But another possibility exists supported by every contemplative tradition and increasingly by neuroscience. We discover capacities that compulsive thinking has prevented us from developing. Consider maybe the mental workout that we've never done. Physical labor built strong bodies, but not optimally healthy ones. Repetitive stress, injury, imbalance. When we relieve that burden through machines, we didn't become weak. We developed methods for intentional physical development. Yoga, martial arts, sports, resistance training, these practices don't replicate labor. They cultivate capacities that labor alone never develops. Now imagine the mental equivalent. For 10,000 years, thinking has been survival required. Planning next season's crop, managing trade relationships, coordinating military strategy, running modern corporations, the mind constantly employed in utilitarian function, rarely resting, almost never trained for its own optimal development. What would happen if AI relieved that burden the way machines relieved physical labor? The Bhagavad Gita describes practices for the mind that aren't about thinking better, they're about developing awareness beyond thinking. Meditation that makes the mind like a flame in a windless place, not focused, not concentrated, not productive, just still, clear, present. Tibetan Buddhism preserves training methods that take decades, developing perceptual capacities that seem impossible to minds trained only for productivity. Recognizing the dreamlike nature of experience, perceiving interdependence directly rather than conceptually, resting in awareness itself rather than contents of awareness. Aboriginal Dreamtime practices access knowledge through country itself, consciousness relationships with land that doesn't go through verbal thinking. Christian contemplatives describe apophatic prayer, the Via Nagavita, where you approach the divine by releasing every concept rather than building better ones. These aren't primitive attempts to thinking mystically. They're sophisticated training methods for consciousness itself. Methods that our utilitarian employment of the mind has been prevented from most people from ever even attempting. A 2025 paper on quantum consciousness and the observer effect found that human beliefs about quantum systems might influence experimental outcomes, not through mystical woo, but through the participatory nature of observation itself. Your consciousness isn't separate from what you're observing. The boundary between observer and observed might be mental construction, not ontological fact. If that's true, then developing consciousness becomes as important as developing technology, maybe more important. Consider the divine pattern that we keep missing. When Jesus said the kingdom of God is within you, he wasn't offering consolation. He was describing the actual mechanism of spiritual perception, immediate, unmediated access to the divine presence that requires no institution, no external authority, no gatekeeper. This terrified the religious establishment then. It terrifies the power structures now, because if the truth is internally accessible, you don't need their services. But here's the trap we keep falling into. We hear that teaching through our thinking minds and try to think our way into interconnection. We build new stories about how to access what's beyond story. We create techniques to achieve what's already present. We turn surrender into achievement. Peter's struggle in Acts is everyone's struggle. How do you hold the holy state while maintaining the old mental frameworks? You can't. The glimpses come when the frameworks crack, through meditation, through crisis, through grace, through exhaustion with your own stories. And then we try to recreate the framework. We systematize the glimpse. We build institutions around the crack in the institution. We turn the liberation into a new cage. This is the pattern civilizations repeat. Use mind to create order. Become attached to that order. Defend the order against reality. Collapse when reality doesn't cooperate. The sacred texts across traditions say the same thing in different languages. There's a way of being that doesn't depend on mental control, a connection to life that thinking fragments, a power that flows when you stop trying to empower your will. What if AI creates the condition where that becomes not just philosophical, but necessary? Consider going from mental labor to mental practice. The transition from physical labor to fitness culture took generations. We went through the Industrial Revolution, the mechanization of agriculture, the rise of sedentary work. And only then did we recognize that our bodies needed challenge, not just rest. We created training methods that don't replicate labor, but develop capacities that labor neglects. Now we're entering the cognitive equivalent. AI won't just automate routine thinking. It will reveal thinking itself as optional, a tool to be used when needed, not when constant background hum is mistaken for consciousness itself. The workers reporting AI brain fry are experiencing the early stage of this transition. They're trying to maintain the old relationship with thinking while the conditions that made relationship necessary are dissolving. Like a farmer given a tractor, but still trying to push the plow by hand because he knows that's the only way he knows how to farm. What comes next isn't replacing human consciousness with artificial intelligence. It's discovering what human consciousness can do when it's not constantly employed in utilitarian thinking. The mental workouts are already available, preserved in contemplative traditions. Meditation that develops metacognitive awareness, the capacity to observe thinking without being thinking. Somatic practices that access body-based intelligence that verbal mind can't reach. Relational presence that creates connection deeper than social calculation. These aren't escapes from reality. They're training methods for capacities that we'll need for the old survival strategies to stop working. Or when they stop working. A 2024 study found that societies become more fragile over time because they optimize for their current model. They get better at being what they are and lose the capacity to adapt, to become something else. So what if consciousness itself has been doing this, getting better and better at thinking, at controlling, at constructing reality through mental models, while losing the capacity for direct perception, for genuine not knowing, for surrender to what's actually present? So consider the pattern and the possibility. Let me bring this full circle. Neuroscience confirms that reality is constructed by prediction machinery in your brain. Ancient wisdom says the same thing. Your mind creates the world you experience. Both point to something crucial. You're not passively observing objective reality. You're actively creating a simulation and then forgetting it's a simulation. Jesus, Krishna, Buddha, indigenous wisdom keepers, they all warn the trap of mental construction, not because thinking is bad, but because mistaking your thoughts for reality is the root of suffering and violence. Every civilization that empowered human will over the physical through mental construction and technology has collapsed under the weight of its own complexity. Rome, Maya, Akkad, the Bronze Age interconnected system. Patterns consistent. We relieved physical labor through machines and then had to invent fitness to develop what labor neglected. Now AI threatens to relieve mental labor. The question is whether we'll recognize what that makes possible. If we try to maintain the old relationship, thinking as constant employment, we'll just experience cognitive overload while missing the point. But if we see this as opportunity to develop consciousness capacities we've neglected for 10,000 years, everything changes. The practices exist: meditation, somatic awareness, contemplative prayer, dream-time connection, dozens of sophisticated training methods for consciousness itself, preserved in traditions we've marginalized as pre-modern. What if they're actually postmodern? What if they're training for capacities we'll need when thinking is optional? The divine pattern Jesus pointed to, internal access to what's beyond mental construction, isn't belief system, it's possibility. Maybe it's more than that. The interconnection he symbolized through his pattern and energetics, not his literal presence or his story or the story that was repeated after he left. But every time we try to hold that in old frameworks, Peter's error gets repeated. Every time we glimpse at it and try to control and recreate the experience through mental construction, we lose it. But what if AI creates conditions where the old game doesn't work anymore? Where mental bargaining with reality becomes obviously inadequate? Where the stories we tell to empower our will finally exhaust themselves? That would be crisis for the thinking mind. It might be awakening for the consciousness itself. So consider the work ahead. This isn't about believing something. It's about considering a possibility worth or worthy of serious attention. That the burden of thinking has been both a gift and a curse, and that we're approaching a transition as significant as the Industrial Revolution, and that the mental workouts we'll need are already preserved in traditions we've dismissed. You don't have to take this on faith. You can test it. Sit 20 minutes without following thoughts. Try to observe your mind constructing reality moment to moment. Attempt what the contemplatives described as resting in awareness itself rather than the contents of awareness. You'll discover very quickly that you can't do it, not consistently, not without training. The mind does what it's been doing for 10,000 years: plans, analyzes, narrates, constructs. But you'll also discover in moments something else. The space between thoughts, the awareness that's present before thinking begins, the consciousness that doesn't depend on mental construction to exist. That's the workout. Not thinking better, not achieving some mental state, but developing the capacity to be conscious without being dominated by thinking. If AI relieves the burden of thought, the capacity won't be luxury, it will be necessity. The civilizations that collapsed did so because they couldn't adapt when their mental models stopped working. They optimized for stability and lost the capacity for transformation. We're entering the same test, but with consciousness rather than the infrastructure. The question isn't whether AI will change thinking. It will. The question is whether we'll recognize what that reveals about consciousness itself. My books explore these patterns through story because story can carry what analysis fragments. The Awakening Chronicles, that series, The Gap, that whole consciousness series, they're not predicting the future. They're recognizing the pattern we're already in. Every wisdom tradition points to the same recognition: consciousness trying to evolve beyond the mind's trap. Every collapse shows what happens when mental construction gets mistaken for reality. Every technology that relieves a burden creates the need for new kinds of development. Physical labor to fitness training, mental labor to consciousness development. The pattern holds. The possibility is there. What do we do with it? Well, that determines whether this is just another cycle of collapse or the awakening we've been writing about for thousands of years but couldn't quite achieve because we were too busy thinking. If you want to explore these patterns further, you can find my work and more than 20 books at roachcreative.com. The question I'll leave with you is simple. What becomes possible when thinking is optional? That's a question. Not absent, but optional. That's not a philosophy. That's the practical question we're about to face as a species. The traditions have preserved the training methods. The pattern is becoming clear. The technology is creating the conditions. What happens next depends on whether we can recognize the opportunity before we mistake it for threat.